Welcome to Between Drinks, a podcast where we travel the world one drink at a time. I'm your host, Carol Griffin, a mezcal sommelier, traveling bartender, and an all-around drinks nerd. In each episode, I'll take you somewhere new to dive into a local drink with a story to tell. We'll talk about its history and how it's made, but also its connection to the place and the people that make it what it is. There's a great story behind every great drink, and I can't wait to share them with you. Thanks for listening. Welcome back. This season, we're diving further into Mexican spirits that aren't made from agave. And this episode is about a classic spirit that I'm sure you've had plenty of experience with. I'm talking about gin, or ginebra, as we say in Mexico. Gin is interesting because it's not defined by its base like a lot of spirits, like whiskey, rum, or even tequila. It's made with a neutral grain spirit and then characterized by its botanicals, specifically the inclusion of juniper. As long as juniper is the predominant flavor, you can call your spirit gin. It's basically flavored vodka, if you want to be really rude about it. The list of botanicals used to be pretty simple, but as gin is made in more and more countries around the world, we're seeing a wider variety of botanicals and thus a wider variety of gins. Producers are using herbs, spices, and fruits local to their region and tailoring them to the flavor profiles of the people around them. Mexico's gin industry is about 20 years old, but most brands have been around for half that. And while that's roughly the same amount of time as Mexican whiskey, for example, I feel like gin hit its stride a little faster. In part, that's probably because gin is faster to make, or at least to get to market. You don't have to wait 3 years while it ages in a barrel. But also, gin is just more popular here. Market studies show that after tequila and mezcal, gin is actually the most popular spirit in Mexico, which I was kind of surprised by. Those gins used to all be imported, but a growing number of them are local, and I think that's awesome. I love supporting local brands, obviously, but gin is a spirit based on its botanicals. And Mexico is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. Stands to reason, you could do some pretty cool stuff with the botanicals available here. And make pretty cool stuff they do. So pull up a bar stool and let's dive in to Mexican gin. Gin's grandfather is a spirit called Geneva, which the Dutch started distilling in the 13th century. Geneva, juniper, you see the phonetics going on there? It came to Britain with immigrants at the turn of the 17th century. And let's just say the 300 or so years that followed were pretty wild, to say the least. London had just become the biggest city in the world, and its influx of both immigrants and people from the countryside, combined with poor infrastructure, low wages, horrible living and working conditions, and well, let's just say cheap gin was the Band-Aid. If there ever was a perfect example of this podcast premise, that you could tell the story of a place through its most famous drink, London and the story of gin would be it. But that's a story for another episode, and I do have plans to make it, so hold tight. For now, let's just say that the 1800s is where gin really became the spirit we know today. It became synonymous with London and Britain, and today it even has its own style of gin referred to as London dry gin. Gin was super popular for 100 years, both in Europe and abroad, and then fell out of fashion during what the cocktail industry refers to as the dark ages of cocktails. So dramatic, I love it. And what they're really referring to here is the 70s, 80s, and 90s. During this time, bartenders were largely relying on mass-produced mixes and shit ingredients rather than fresh produce and craft spirits. People drank simple mixed drinks or super sweet novelty cocktails, and gin really didn't have a place in those drinks. It is, however, really good in a craft cocktail. So when the craft cocktail boom kicked off in the early 2000s, when like all the speakeasies started opening and people started fat washing and milk punching things, gin was suddenly back in a big way. And it led to hundreds, if not thousands, of gin brands to pop up very quickly. Suddenly, everyone was putting their spin on this old school spirit. New botanicals, a new style of flavored gins, even barrel-aged gins. But to understand the differences in all of those different types of gins, we should talk a little bit more about how gin is made.
Para elaborar ginebra tenemos 3 formas de extracción, que es la Old Tom, el proceso de maceración en frío, el distiller gin, que es el destilado neutro en la olla con los botánicos, y el arrastre de vapor. En el Old Tom lo que se recomienda poner son botánicos con fructosa, para no cambiar la fructosa, y con esto el sabor si lo pones a...
That was Alex Sanchez from our Monaco Gin, who was nice enough to walk me through all the different categories and styles of gin earlier this year. There are lots of different ways to make gin, but essentially you're infusing a neutral spirit with juniper and other botanicals. The neutral spirit is usually made from grain, but it doesn't have to be, and the whole point is that it's neutral. Botanicals are delicate, and so are their flavors, and so you need something that's not going to overpower them. You would never use a strong spirit like, say, mezcal as a base. That would be wild. If I were on camera right now, I'd look at you very meaningfully, but since I can't do that, just know that this is me foreshadowing what's to come. As I was saying, you take your neutral spirit and you infuse it with juniper and other botanicals in whatever way you want. There are two main ways this is done. Some distillers macerate or steep the botanicals in the neutral alcohol for a few hours or days to extract the flavors. This process is good for full-bodied gins made from hearty ingredients. Others use vapor infusion or percolation. This is where you install a basket inside the still for the botanicals. As the alcohol vapor rises, it passes through those botanicals, and this really preserves more delicate flavors like flowers and citrus peels and results in a lighter, more subtle profile. There are other methods, but those are the main two, and some distillers will even use both. And as always, there are an infinite number of micro decisions involved that make this both an art and a science.
Los botánicos nos llegan en esas cubetas blancas. Ahora pasamos a verlos. El jefe de producción, con órdenes de Andrés Valverde, hace la receta exacta y ya que tiene todos los elementos juntos en los azules, eso lo pasa para acá para que se muela.
That was Alex again, from Armonico Gin, which is made in Querétaro. If you listen to the episode on Mexican whiskey, you already know that Querétaro is a mid-sized city in central Mexico that has a surprising number of distilleries and breweries. Armonico has a distillery right there in the city, and they're known for their London Dry-style gin, which is made with 32 botanicals. 20 of those botanicals are endemic to Mexico, and the other 12 are classic London Dry-style ingredients, most of which are imported from the Mediterranean. The neutral spirit is made from corn because, of course, this is Mexico and we love our corn. It's diluted to 60 proof, and then they infuse the botanicals with a combination of maceration and vapor infusion, the processes we just talked about. So some of the botanicals are being ground up, steeped in the neutral alcohol, and then that liquid is put into the still. But they also put some different botanicals in the basket for vapor infusion. And when all of this comes off the still, they're blending it with a little water and a little more of the neutral spirit. And if this sounds like a lot of work, that's because it is. Making a great gin is a lot of work, and the result of a lot of trial and error and many, many tests over usually many years. And Armonico has been at it for a while. In fact, their founder and master distiller, Andrés Valverde, started making craft beer when he was just 16. And then, at 18, he set up a 1-liter still in his apartment and started selling bootleg gin to his friends, who eventually convinced him to start selling the bottles, thankfully for us. Now he's 30, and I just saw Armonico in the big chain supermarket across the street from my house for the first time, which is pretty fucking cool. The gin industry is dominated by the London Dry Gin category, which is a gin that has no added sugar or coloring. This is an official category of gin, and so when people say London Dry, it has a particular meaning ascribed to it. And you can make it anywhere, so it doesn't have to be from London. But in addition to the London Dry category, there are other official categories, and there are unregulated, less official styles that are mostly used colloquially to describe and categorize gins. And so now that Mexico has a dozen gin brands, it begs the question, what is a Mexican-style gin?
Creo que es muy temprano porque justo nos estamos basando todavía las marcas que conocen la RUE, el reglamento de la Unión Europea.
That was Alex again, sharing that in his opinion, it's too early to say for sure what will come to define Mexican gin. And this was a pretty common answer that rings true to me too. But in my research and extensive taste testing, wink wink, there have been a few things that have stood out to me about Mexican gin when I compare it to the gins I've had from other places around the world. For starters, the base in Mexican gin is usually corn or agave instead of grain. But because the whole point is to have a neutral base, this doesn't really impact the final flavor. If you want agave, go drink mezcal. The reason that distillers are using it here is less about trying to impart those flavors and more about the fact that that's what's accessible. It's just easier to use. Second, there tend to be more botanicals, and more endemic ones for sure. Many of the botanicals that are essential for gin's ginny flavor, like juniper, aren't native, and so those are usually imported from the Mediterranean. But producers are putting an emphasis on the flavors of Mexico by including a lot of herbs, fruits, etc. that are native. It's often maximalist as hell. And then there's what I refer to as the weird shit, for lack of a better term. Across the board, Mexican distillers are not afraid to try something new. And that definitely applies to the gin category.
I'd say there are three defining reasons behind its creation. First, my brother and co-founder Jose Luis has always had a fascination with rare and distinctive gins. He's the kind of person who seeks out bottles you cannot easily find twice. He even has a personal collection of rare gins. Second, I had just returned from living in London, so I was immersed, in the heart of the global gin revival. And at the same time, the Mexican spirits were rising. You would see a lot of mezcal out there. And lastly, your family, as I mentioned, has been in the hospitality world for generations. So creating this gin wasn't just about crafting a drink. It was about capturing the spirit of Chihuahua, of our home, and expressing it through a contemporary and also in a way in a global lens, right? So that's how we came about with a gin finished with sotol.
One of my favorite things about Mexican spirits is producers' willingness to fuck around and find out. And the gin category probably embodies that more than most. Whether it's a gin made from grapes that weren't good enough to be wine, or one made from my precious agave, or even a gin packed with 32 botanicals that represent the 32 states of Mexico. These are all real examples, and I think they prove my point that there is no shortage of bottles that make me raise my eyebrow and go, "Excuse me, what?" Which is exactly what happened when I tried Acronimo for the first time. That clip you just heard was one of the founders, Alessandra Camino Crial. And before we get too deep into her story, I want to clarify that Armonico, the gin from Querétaro that we just talked about, is different from Acronimo, the gin we're going to talk about from Chihuahua. I realize that my two favorite gin brands from Mexico have inconveniently similar names, so bear with me. I'm going to try to clarify them as the one from Querétaro and the one from Chihuahua when it makes sense to do so. Back to Acronimo, the one from Chihuahua. I tried Acronimo for the first time at a bar show. They had just launched their gin and sotol, and if we're being honest, I really only stopped to try their sotol. The guy working there was like, "You got to try the gin too," and I smiled and said sure, but I wasn't really expecting much. It literally made me do a double take, y'all. The guy's face very clearly said "I told you so" without him having to actually say it. It's that distinctive. And that's because Acronimo's gin is blended with their sotol.
Other than Jose Luis really liking unique gins and having, like a small collection of them, we also wanted to make something very not only authentic, but something that reflected Chihuahua's bold spirit, right? Something that was terroir driven. So that's how we decided to also integrate Sotol and blended it to the equation. And the beautiful part of it is that it's not omnipresent, right? So the flavor profile is very cardamom driven, citrusy. You can also feel the peppers, a bit of the lavender, but then at the end you feel the punch of sotol. So we wanted for the gin to have a Chihuahuan identity.
That was Alessandra again, the co-founder of Acronimo. Acronimo is based in the northern state of Chihuahua, which, from a spirits perspective, is known for its sotol. Sotol is an artisanal spirit with a long history. It's kind of like mezcal in a lot of ways, but it's made from a plant called Daisy liron instead of agave, and we used to think it was a type of agave and that sotol was a type of mezcal, but science has proved us wrong. It's its own plant, its own species, and thus its own category. But if you've never tried sotol, mezcal is the closest comparison. I always think of it as being a little greener, grassier, a little less smoky. But like mezcal, the flavor can vary depending on the region because Chihuahua is a huge state, the biggest in Mexico. So there's a lot of variety there. And Acronimo makes both the sotol and their gin blended with sotol.
At the beginning, we were thinking of using the sotol as a base spirit, so have the sotol and then macerated with the botanicals. But then the nature of gin is that it has a lower tolerance to methanol than sotol, mezcal, and tequila have, just because of the way they're have normally been produced. So that's when we segued and we said, we're going to do kind of like a traditional gin. And then at the end, we blended with sotol. So we just add 17% of sotol at the end. And it's from the variety Willeri only.
The result is a gin that is both juniper forward and floral, but has an earthy flavor and subtle smokiness that is more like a spent match than a full-on campfire. It's a gin that gin lovers will appreciate, but it's also one that I think non-gin drinkers could get behind too, and I love that. I don't want all my gin to taste the same, and Mexican gin has a lot of variety that I love to play around with. Armonico, the first gin, the one from Querétaro, is the perfect example of a Mexican dry gin. It's taking a classic spirit and proving that Mexico can make a damn good version. You can easily slip it into your favorite gin cocktail, whether that's a martini, a gin and tonic, or a Negroni, and it'll sing. And that's not something to sniff at because it's really hard to make a gin that works in all of those cocktails. A lot of times you find one that kind of only works in a martini or is too much for a martini, but is great for a gin and tonic. And so the fact that Armonico kind of works across the board is one of the reasons it's always on my bar cart. Acronimo, the one from Chihuahua, is the other side of the coin. It shows that you don't have to do things the way they've always been done. You can take an old British favorite and combine it with an old Mexican favorite for something totally new. Together, these two gins represent Mexican spirits to me. The classic interpretation that's made really well with a little Mexican twist, and the more experimental version that's pushing the envelope. I have bottles of both on my back bar, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Now that I've convinced you that you need to try Mexican gin immediately, let's talk about where to find it. This category is a little bit easier to explore outside of Mexico, especially if you live in the US, so you have a lot of options. Condesa Gin is probably the most well-known. It's made right here in Mexico City by an amazing female distiller that you already met, Hiham Salome, the founder of Sheila. So if you listened to the aperitif episode, you already learned a little bit about her and her distillery. Condesa Gin has 3 variations with different profiles, and every single bottle is made by Salome and her distillery. It's widely available in Mexico, as well as the US, UK, and a few other European cities. It seems to be growing pretty fast. Armonico, the great London-style dry gin that we just talked about, is available in Mexico, the US, Germany, Australia, Dubai, and probably more by the time this episode comes out, so keep an eye out. Acronimo, the Sotol finished gin from Chihuahua, is available in Mexico and the US. It's still pretty new, so hopefully we'll see them head overseas at some point. And lastly, I want to shout out Gracias a Dios. It's produced by the makers of Juan del Campo, the Mexican whiskey we talked about in the first episode. And the base is agave. So this is the one that I was foreshadowing earlier. When I heard they were making a gin out of agave, I was like, absolutely not. How dare you? But it's really good. It's only available in Mexico, though, so that's one, make a note and keep an eye out for it. So next time you're in Mexico, you can throw a bottle in your bag. Well, that's all for this episode, folks. There are a lot more Mexican gins where these came from, so I rounded up info about all of them and threw it up on my website. Check that out for a long list of brands to look out for, as well as links on where to buy the ones we talked about in this episode. That link is betweendrinks.co/Mexican gin. If you're new to Between Drinks, I also want to make sure that you know I write a weekly newsletter where I talk about the overlap between travel, culture, and drinks. It's basically a mini version of this pod, and it's where I share a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff that goes into these episodes, trips to distilleries, conversations with brewers and bartenders, and specific recommendations on where to get great drinks in cities around the world. You can subscribe at that same link, betweendrinks.co/Mexican gin. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you for the next episode as we dive further into other Mexican spirits.